Thank you very much, Dryden, for taking the time today. I really appreciate you coming on the show. For those people who don't know you, you're the co-founder and CEO of Blue Book Cities. Have a background, I understand, with like surfing and working for a hedge fund in New York City, but would be great just to get kind of your introduction for the people who have no idea, what Blue Book Cities is or who you are.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me, man. Yeah, so, well, I mean, I guess, yeah, so Blue Book Cities, first of all, we're a full stack city builder, and I run a community called Praxis, and we're building a city for members of this community. We congregate sort of mostly online, but we have some in-person events. We do retreats and adventures and sort of fun stuff. But it's a community of mostly entrepreneurs and people who want to sort of find a heroic project that they can sort of like pour their sort of like energy into and sort of get really excited about and so forth. But yeah, so that's kind of Praxis. That's Blue Book. As for me, I mean, I grew up in Santa Barbara. Yeah, I mean, I was surfing a lot, as you mentioned. I sort of like traveled around the world in high school and competed in surf contests and stuff like that. Um, but I was also really interested in sort of like libertarianism and sort of this notion of new cities, new societies. My family came over to the U.S. from Northern Ireland in sort of the early 18th century to flee from sort of like a kind of like broken sort of economic system, and sort of political and religious conflict, sort of much like what we see today in the U.S. And they sort of had faith in the frontier and sort of got on a boat where he's sort of braving like scurvy and sort of the mortality rate was incredibly high for people who sort of came over to the U.S. that early on. But they did it anyway because they wanted to sort of build a better life for themselves and their family and so forth. And and went to the U.S. and sort of were some of like sort of the founding members of like Pennsylvania and fought in the Revolutionary War and all these things. So I found this sort of notion of sort of the stories of like immigrants moving to the United States, to be sort of deeply interesting and sort of, of course it's personal. Um, and, and yeah, so, I mean, I guess like, yeah, sort of through my childhood, I like thought a lot about this, about like sort of starting new societies, going out into the frontier. I think we've sort of like lost our frontier spirit in America to some degree, which is a little bit, sad, I think, but I think we can get it back. I think we can recover a frontier spirit. And I think the sort of most exciting way to do so is to sort of build new cities on the frontier.
Right. Yeah. A lot of interesting points there that I want to dig deep on. Before we get too deep into the city type stuff, how'd you get into surfing and like you ended up traveling the world a fair bit, I understand, and that kind of sparked some of your interest in cities in the first place, being able to see the world like that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so yeah, I grew up in Santa Barbara. So like most of my friends in school surfed. It's kind of like the thing to do. So started surfing when I was like 10 or 11. I was a pretty competitive person. So yeah, just took it really, really seriously. Would like wake up at like 6 a.m. and like bike to the beach. I didn't live super, super close to the beach, but would bike to the beach with my board, down these sort of like steep hills and so forth. And would surf before school and then bike all the way up, back uphill to school. And sort of did that for like a number of years and started competing in surf contests and sort of wasn't very good. Sort of lose like pretty consistently fairly early on in these surf contests. And would be sort of driving like 2 or 3 hours like up and down the coast to like do these things. But I just sort of kept like hammering away at it. And eventually I got pretty, pretty decent, got some sponsors, and yeah, I got to travel a ton. And yeah, and that sort of sparked my interest in, yeah, I mean, just visiting like, sort of tens of like, interesting international cities, like every, every year was like pretty fascinating to me as like a young sort of person. When I was like 14, 15, it was pretty interesting sort of seeing all the different cultures and so forth.
And I understand you co-founded Blue Book Cities with another, I think his name was Charlie, who was also a hedge fund guy in New York, but also had a stint in professional sports. I think he played with the Buffalo Bills for a little bit. How did you guys decide that this was something you wanted to do together as opposed to, going and starting this idea yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so I was deeply interested in this stuff, like sort of philosophically for a really long time. And I wanted to sort of like learn more about the industry, like sort of how new cities are built and so forth. So I started interning at a hedge fund where my portfolio manager was the chairman of this large master plan community development company, and they make like sort of private cities, more like private towns or something like this in the U.S. But so did that for a year, then sort of lateraled over to another fund. And that's where I met Charlie. And yeah, he had just gotten he just sort of like was on the Bills briefly, sort of didn't work out, and then got sort of hired as like an MBA intern basically, or like a sort of early sort of research analyst at the fund where I was working, and we had to go to Puerto Rico for a research trip. And we ended up like surfing a bit down there. He was like just starting to get into surfing, and we just started talking about the sort of like crazy city stuff. When we were like sitting out, waiting for waves. And he thought it was pretty exciting. And we sort of liked working together, and we started doing some research on the side, trying to figure out like, how might we actually execute on this. And we made a bunch of progress. Like we got a bunch of interesting calls, and we started to realize that it was sort of feasible in ways that I think a lot of other people in the space didn't sort of appreciate that it might be. And yeah, I mean, sometimes you just start working on these side projects and they sort of take on like a life of their own, and they sort of start to, they start to consume more and more of your time. And like investing is kind of like, it's like a bit zero sum. It's sort of like if you have like, if you're like sort of 98th percentile on like a name, like on a company, and like, the guy sort of, is sort of across from you is 99th percentile, like, you're going to lose money and he's going to make money. So, yeah, I think like if you're not like 100% sort of committed, like obsessive about public markets investing, like you're probably going to lose a lot of money. So at a certain point, it was just like, okay, well, like, we're dedicating a lot of time to the city stuff. Let's just go all in on the city stuff and not sort of, waste anyone's time with the investing stuff while we sort of are truly like interested in the city stuff.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I can kind of resonate myself, like a little bit of a different angle within finance, but I started my career in investment banking. And so like it's fee based, right? So like you actually, it's a little bit different in that you're not at risk necessarily of like losing to the person across the table. You just kind of are providing a service. And my issue really is a similar reasoning that like this isn't really what I love to do. And if I'm not doing what I love to do, I'll probably not be exceptional at it. Um,
Yeah.
and in banking, it's like, I can do a 7 out of 10 job or a 9 out of 10 job. And ultimately, especially as like an analyst or an associate coming up, there's not a whole lot you can do to impact like the actual, the money or the success of the pairing of the merger or acquisition or whatever metric you want to take to know, feel like you're adding value. The 7 out of 10 performer versus the 9 out of 10 performer, like not a huge delta there. Did that contribute to your thinking, not only like doing what you love or doing what you're genuinely interested in, but the fact that only in doing so, you could really do something exceptional?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think, yeah, I mean, certainly like, I want to be sort of like, I want to be the best in the world at whatever I'm doing. And I think, yeah, I mean, to the extent that you have sort of other interests that are detracting from your focus, that's like a really sort of not good thing. I think, sort of, yeah, the further out on the curve you go, the sort of like the returns start to get nonlinear. If you're like 99th percentile, you can make like an enormous amount of money. If you're sort of like 90th percentile, there are like a ton of other people who are 90th percentile. Yeah, I think you really want to be sort of like extremely focused and sort of, yeah, you want to be insanely good at things, or sort of give them up and find something else that you can be insanely good at.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to talk about Blue Book Cities and Praxis you mentioned earlier. Correct me if I'm wrong in like setting this up, but Blue Book Cities, I understand, is kind of like I think you've called it like a while ago, you called it like a Dubai as a service, or it's been called like a Shenzhen as a service, kind of like a new city building service, where Blue Book Cities can help people, groups of people build cities in countries around the world built around values rather than economic values, such as like a port, which was a lot more relevant a couple hundred years ago than it is today. Now you can build Israel, centralized around people believing in a religion, or same with Salt Lake City. It's a much more feasible concept that's already been demonstrated. What hasn't necessarily been demonstrated is explicitly building such a community online, and then bringing that into physical form. Like Israel, was in some degree based on like a book. Salt Lake City, I'm not quite as familiar as to like how that actually came to form, but that's how I think of like what you're doing with Blue Book Cities. On the other hand, Praxis is actually like the first example. And so you're building this group of people, this community online, with a desire to one day become a city, and ultimately have some form of sovereignty to be able to explore types of governments, different types of technologies that you just simply can't, or at least easily can't do in most places existing around the world today, which fall into like, to varying degrees, they have different similarities in terms of the regulations and laws and et cetera. Is that kind of the right way to think about how you're getting started here? And how did Praxis, it sounds like, kind of become birthed within Blue Book Cities?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, the core insight, there are a few things going on. So, I mean, I think there's this epidemic of loneliness in cities, that I think is a function of sort of cities basically operating as labor markets. So people move to cities to participate in the labor market. They move to cities for jobs. Companies move to cities for access to talented workers. And this is basically how cities function. And sort of before the Enlightenment, like cities were also sort of and still today to some extent in various cities, but sort of like most modern cities in the West are sort of just labor markets, and they're not sort of predicated on sort of like buying into any sort of shared notion of good and evil, or sort of shared values or anything like this. They're just sort of pure labor markets. And what this means is that sort of your moral compass and that of your neighbors might be totally sort of misaligned. And in terms of sort of the world you want to build, like your sort of your values determine sort of the future that's desirable to you. And I think Peter Thiel talks a lot about this sort of question of stagnation. He talks a lot about sort of at a meta level the need to ship an optimistic sort of vision for the future, and so forth. But I think really the reason we're unable to sort of get to the future and sort of provide charismatic visions for the future is because we're misaligned in terms of values in the places where we congregate. So I think this is sort of the sort of meta insight with sort of I mean the term I use is affinity cities. So we talk a lot about building cities that are based on affinities and not just labor markets. And I think this sort of was a pie in the sky idea about a year ago, but sort of post COVID, as the labor market has been sort of abstracted, sort of like, from the city to the cloud. And now sort of if you're a knowledge worker, your job follows you wherever you go. Cities will be organized on different principles, not just that of the labor market. People can move to cities because they sort of share beliefs, with people, or because, people in a certain location are fighting for a cause that they believe in, or because they champion a vision for the future that they believe in. And sort of within this microcosm, they can build that future. And I think this is like, sort of highly compelling, sort of in a pluralistic way. I think you can build a lot of sort of interesting, a lot of interesting cities with sort of divergent, values and technologies and so forth. But sort of, yeah, I mean, I guess when I wanted to ship my instance of this, like sort of, what are the values that I think are lacking? I think there's been this like tremendous loss of, I mentioned sort of this pioneer spirit, but I think more specifically heroism. We've sort of lost sight of why heroism is important in sort of, sort of like, post-Enlightenment. I think, I mean, basically there's this notion that sort of like fighting doesn't provide us tremendous value, sort of, violence is not good. I agree with those things. We want to sort of minimize the amount of violence that takes place in our society. But there are still these sort of highly thematic individuals that sort of, seek out sort of adventure and want to go out onto the frontier and so forth. And sort of like, war isn't a great vehicle for this, but sort of nothing isn't a great, we sort of need to have some sort of hero system that allows people who sort of feel the call to the frontier, feel the call to war and so forth, to sort of do like socially sort of positive things. And this is sort of the role of heroism. Heroism is sort of like a socially positive, sort of like gallant, sort of heroic, courageous action. And I don't think we really have a functioning hero system in our society. Like some might say, hey, like, sort of, entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurs are the heroes, but, entrepreneurs that succeed to any meaningful degree are vilified. And very few people have been able to sort of, really transgress the sort of lack of a hero system in a sort of, brave way. I think Elon Musk is, one of the only examples of people who've been able to do this. But so with Praxis, the notion is that, sort of within Praxis, the members are looking for their sort of heroic project, their life's work that's tremendously sort of like socially positive. And the way that we sort of our sort of like ideological framework, I guess, has a sort of focus on the pursuit of immortality, both sort of like physical immortality. We want to live longer. We want to sort of like escape aging, but we also want to achieve symbolic immortality, which is sort of heroism, this notion that I've been describing. Like Napoleon talked about sort of the only true immortality being eternal memory in the minds of men. And I think this is a really interesting notion, and one that we need to sort of recover in the 21st century to give these sort of highly thematic individuals something, something to sort of focus on that's socially positive.
Yeah, I've read, some of your work in and around Blue Book Cities talks about heroism a lot. You've brought up a couple of terms that were kind of interesting to me, like civilizational immortality. You talk about human maximalism, I think it was, and it's all somewhat entangled and related from my perspective, at least. And I'm not sure I have as clear of a differentiation between some of these terms as I'm sure you do. But I think about, like, you mentioned life extension, but not just life extension, but actually optimizing the life, that you're extending, and giving people a greater sense of purpose and increased happiness, health, wealth. What drove, I became interested in the concept that we could attack aging directly a few years ago so that we could live longer and healthier lives. Had like Aubrey de Grey on as the first episode of the podcast, followed like work of Laura Deming and others in the space. And I'm starting to hear about it a little bit more, and it seems to actually coincide with, you find someone who's interested in life extension, and it's a decent bet that they're also interested in like crypto, or, space travel and a lot of these other futuristic ideas. And I think you start to feel a little bit, if you're paying attention, and this is part of the motivation for the podcast and the types of people I have on as well, is like you start to feel some momentum in this more, referencing like Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 book, because you kind of brought it up, this definite optimism, contrasting sort of indefinite optimism, or more recently I would say indefinite pessimism, where every movie about the future is dystopian and there's not a lot of imagination and clear vision for a better future. That I think is starting to change a little bit. And so you obviously think that this is a sensible time to go ahead and start Praxis, and kind of encourage people within the community to find their heroic project. 2020, I think you wrote, is like, it's been chaotic, but sometimes chaos brings clarity. Did you decide, did you start pursuing this prior to COVID, and prior to seeing this kind of paradigm shift in the world and move to remote and all the rest unfold? And regardless of the answer to that question, like, why, I guess the question is like, why now? You talked about, loneliness, and people are like knowledge workers are no longer attached to their offices, and things like that. But the process of actually building a city, I imagine, is quite tough. Do you think people are ready for that? And do you kind of feel that same momentum that I'm kind of trying to describe?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess, yeah, I mean, with a lot of these things, like being too early is sort of the same as being wrong. This is sort of a, classic sort of like, value sort of take. But Yeah, I mean, it would have been really hard to do what we're doing like 15 months ago or something like that. I mean, basically, when we started the company, um, we we knew that, yeah, I mean, we saw these trends like starting to sort of accelerate, but they were still fairly early, and we weren't sure how long it was going to take sort of before people, particularly in San Francisco and New York and LA and so forth, were ready to move somewhere else, go out into the frontier. Yeah, I mean, I think there are these sort of like slow burning sort of issues, like, yeah, like I mentioned, loneliness in cities, I mean, just like the general sort of lack of engagement in like civic, like sort of, this whole like bowling alone notion, like things like this. And sort of how do these things actually end up, breaking sort of when do people realize, hey, we need to actually sort of step up and change things, or else things are really going to go off track and, maybe get apocalyptic and so forth. And so, yeah, I mean, for us, like, we wanted to really deeply understand sort of how new cities are built, because we suspected that sort of in the near future, there was going to be tremendous demand to sort of go out into the frontier, build a new city, build these sort of like innovation zones, where one can pursue, sort of, yeah, like sort of longevity tech and sort of self-driving and all these different things that, that are highly promising, but that are sort of, encumbered by regulation. And so yeah, I mean, we suspected that sort of soon people would be ready to do these things. We weren't sure what the catalyst would be. So what we did is we went to the places in the world with the highest sort of density of new city projects. And right now, that's sort of West Africa and the Middle East. So we flew to Nigeria and Ghana and spent a lot of time there with people building new cities in 2019. And we were sort of considering doing a project in West Africa. We were thinking about building a sort of West African financial center. We thought this was a super compelling project. It's the biggest regional economy in the world without a financial center. And and so we were thinking about doing this as sort of our first project. And I mean, yeah, so basically what we did is we started sort of pursuing it. We started drafting plans and so forth. And we went to raise money, and the fundraise was going reasonably well. This was in February, and sort of like the COVID news was kind of ramping up. And then it became clear to us that we weren't going to be able to go to West Africa for probably quite a while. And we wanted to sort of get a piece of legislation passed in a West African country, and we realized that sort of wasn't going to happen because of sort of election timelines and things like this. It sort of wasn't going to make sense, and we didn't want to sort of burn cash, for perhaps a year or even longer was our view in March, without having a sort of like sort of when there was sort of a binary outcome that could easily go sort of the other way at the end of that sort of like long sort of like burn stretch. So we're like, man, what should we do? We can't really leave our apartment in New York, kind of stuck here. And I started to get sort of like, pings from more and more friends saying, hey, are you still working on this new city stuff? Blah, blah, blah. Like, super interested in learning more. And I was trying to sort of go on digital detox, like not look at my phone, not look at my computer, just sort of like, meditate, figure out what needed to be done, try to get the round closed. And that was sort of the only interaction I wanted to have with the outside world while I figured out what was really going on. And it slowly dawned on me that sort of this opportunity that I'd been waiting for was finally starting to occur. And now you see with Mayor Suarez in Miami, people are ready to leave, and I think people are ready to leave San Francisco. They're ready to leave New York. They're ready to leave these high tax or poorly run parts of the United States that sort of previously they felt glued to. And yeah, I think there's going to be just sort of, yeah, the mechanism is what I described earlier. It's this sort of like unmooring of the labor market from cities to the cloud, at least for knowledge workers, which, who sort of, produce the most value in sort of the world at this point. So it's tremendous shift. It's the biggest shift in urban dynamics in perhaps centuries. And there are going to be huge winners and huge losers. And I think sort of right now we're right at sort of the cusp of these massive sort of like talent migrations and talent sort of like courting processes. I think I think we're sort of like about to witness one of the biggest sort of like migratory events in sort of human history. I think it's pretty exciting. So yeah, we want to build cities that are sort of, like sort of tailor made for these people who are moving, and specifically those of whom, those that are tired of this sort of, lack of a hero system, sort of lack of purpose. You mentioned sort of sitting at your desk at the investment bank and finding it not to be particularly fulfilling. I mean, I think, you're certainly not alone. And to the extent that we can build a space and build a culture that sort of empowers people to try, big, exciting projects, and sort of de-risks them a bit, because they sort of burn less money dealing with sort of complex regulatory schemes and so forth. I think that's sort of the most exciting way to sort of go about setting up a new city.
When you think about like setting up a new city, first it's in the cloud and then it's physical. And to your point, with the restrictions on travel in the near term, it may be a bit difficult to execute the plan, or at least a plan comparable with what you had in mind kind of initially internationally. And the US, while there, obviously are differences in cost of living between San Francisco and New York versus rural Wyoming, there's not as much variety, and there's not as much maybe willingness from the government necessarily to negotiate with a group of people with deep pockets from a community, or from investors, to allow them to have some sense of sovereignty. And you see bits of it here and there, but there's obviously a reason why your initial plans were international. When you talk about like Praxis now, um, on the one hand, how are you getting, like, why are people interested on joining before there's a physical gathering place? Um, how does that promise kind of change once there is a physical land for everyone to aggregate in? And then, how are you treating this international situation and sort of ambiguity that seems to be, it is possible to permanently relocate, obviously, but it seems to be much more of a headache, and certainly more difficult to visit as like a test run than it would have been a year or two ago. So I guess the question is really around, what are the motivations of people to join now versus later? And, secondarily, how do you think about, COVID obviously accelerated some desire, to your point, San Francisco exodus, New York, people wanting to leave. Um, it accelerated people's desires to work from wherever they want, because they can now work remotely and make the same salary, but live somewhere where their cost of living is less and they can have a higher quality of life. So in that sense, it's been accelerating. But on the international freedom to kind of relocate or visit places or whatever it might be, it's been a bit of a roadblock. So like, how do you think about that trade-off?
Yeah. So yeah, I think travel will come back. This is a short-term issue. I mean, yeah. So certainly there are a lot of countries that want a slice of Silicon Valley, or perhaps the next Silicon Valley. Particularly in countries that are insanely beautiful and have had massive sort of tax revenue shortfalls as a consequence of their sort of tourism spend getting just eviscerated this year. So we're highly focused on countries sort of in the Mediterranean that are insanely beautiful, well connected, and have sort of large plot of land, sort of where we could bring a slice of Silicon Valley. In terms of why people join now, though, I mean, certainly there's this exciting prospect of moving to a new city and founding a new city, sort of being there on day zero, helping shape the culture. Like that's an insanely sort of exciting proposition for certainly all of our members and many other people. But you asked Jude Gamilla on your episode with him about sort of why he joined YC, or at least why he was attracted to the YC community in whatever it was, like 2008 or 2009 or something like that. And his answer was something like, there are just like a ton of sort of insanely interesting, very smart people working on really crazy companies. And I think the answer is basically the same for us. We have a bunch of insane, really bright people working on really interesting companies, riffing on fascinating ideas, and sort of more than that, we are all sort of developing a shared vision for the future, a sort of single vision for the future, that's highly compelling, because it inspires hope, right? So we talk a lot of, so our sort of core idea is Hero-futurism. And the notion is that we should be pursuing immortality. I mentioned this sort of like, at a personal level, pursuing sort of physical immortality and symbolic immortality, but at a civilizational level, sort of also pursuing physical and symbolic civilizational immortality. And these, the sort of notion of immortality is like quite generative. And it causes sort of, if you have sort of an immortal population, there end up being like material resource constraints. You have to develop technology to mitigate those. You have to expand sort of into the universe. You have to go out into the stars. And yeah, I think there's this question of sort of what do you do with more life? There are a lot of exciting things to do with more life, and I don't think any of them involve sitting at a desk all day and sort of like manipulating pixels or something like this, right? So yeah, I think it's quite exciting to sort of be to participate in sort of the early stages of this sort of vision building, this world building process, and to sort of riff with other really smart, interesting people on insane ideas that I think perhaps somewhat uniquely we take very seriously.
Right. And that makes sense. I think what's interesting to me is like, so what, you go out, to use your example from the Jude episode, like you go to join YC and you get to take part in this community and you live in San Francisco, but San Francisco is already kind of the technology hub of the world before YC went there and kind of poured gas on the fire. So like, it's not a super big risk. You probably, if you're going to YC, you're from the US. If not, you're from internationally, but the US is, as it has been for the last few hundred years, viewed as like the land of opportunity. So it's kind of, you're joining a very interesting community that seems like it has a promising future and is excited about building a better future, but within the confines and like the context of a pretty successful micro, society, a city of like San Francisco. This idea that you're bringing up, you don't know where the land is going to be yet, for one. I think it's probably safe to say it's outside of the US. I don't want to, jump to any assumptions, but like, how do you filter, there's lots of communities online. If you take the extreme example and like think of Facebook, it's got billions of people, but they're not in alignment. And so I totally appreciate that. Like your approach values basically alignment on values over everything else. And so like, if you're a part of this community, you have to strongly believe in like the idea that we need a better future and we want to work towards civilizational immortality and longer human life, and heroism as part of kind of a core thread in the civilization and everything like that. But how do you filter beyond kind of alignment on values and wanting to join this online community to make sure that you actually have a group of people that is willing to kind of put their money where their mouth is, and put their feet where their mouth is in a certain sense, and leave where they are to join what will eventually be a physical city, which is a kind of a core premise to it sounds like achieving the vision that you have for Praxis.
Yeah, I mean, it's a few things there. Yeah, I mean, so we're talking to a few different countries. I think like sort of to make another reference to the Jude, like you don't want to fall in love with like a single deal, right? You want to have like a few deals in the pipeline, and sort of analogous to this HQ2 process, where you have a few different countries that are interested in, or in that case, a few different cities that are interested in, recruiting sort of Amazon to come and build this new headquarters and, provide a bunch of jobs and bring a bunch of investment. And so it's sort of like a similar process that we're running, where we're talking to a bunch of different countries, and we have a bunch of sites that we've identified. But I think sort of you don't want to sort of fall in love with a deal before it's closed, and so we're a little bit like coy about sharing details. But yeah, I mean, it'll be outside of the US, it'll be in the Mediterranean, and hopefully we'll have more details to share reasonably soon. In terms of, yeah, I mean, sort of like comparing sort of where we are to where San Francisco is. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I think sort of moving to San Francisco to build your company, it's sort of like analogous to like, joining Google and building sort of an internal project or something like this. So certainly there's like more stability, and sort of like, I think historically, I think this analogy would have worked better. If you're moving to like a new city, there sort of isn't liquidity in the labor market, and you want to build a startup there, and maybe you're, making a real estate bet that like the value of the land will go up because you buy it fairly cheaply, and sort of, New York, the land value is like $1.75 trillion. So if the city ends up like taking off like a rocket ship and becomes sort of a new hub, you could make a ton of money on sort of the land value appreciation. But sort of, I think moving to a new city is like significantly less risky on the downside today than it was a year ago, simply because the cloud labor market's a lot more liquid than it was a year ago. If your company doesn't work out, you can find another job online. So just from like a risk perspective, moving to sort of a new city relative to moving to San Francisco, sort of a year ago, it was sort of like joining a pre-seed company or seed company, sort of as compared to joining Google or something. But today it's actually it's actually like relatively de-risked. What was the second part of the question?
I think the main that sort of covers it. It's basically, it's difficult enough to make sure that an online community which can scale, to from 1,000 people to 100,000 people with the, if, say Elon Musk joins your community, right, and tweets about it overnight, if you're not filtering people and accepting and rejecting applications at the door, you're getting hundreds of thousands of people, I'm assuming. So it's, quality control and alignment control is sort of one thing. Another thing that I think about is kind of willingness to move. And so you mentioned that and I totally agree and appreciate that it's a much lower risk for a much greater reward than it might have been a year ago in a less remote friendly world. But it still strikes me that like people with roots and family and friends in the United States, um, maybe they might have much less of an obstacle to joining and even paying to be a part of a community like yours while it's still in kind of the online building stage. But when push comes to shove and it's time to actually pick up your stuff and move to this Mediterranean hub, there's some conversion, but maybe not all. And I guess the question is really just how do you ensure that the community can make that transition? Obviously, there's a whole nother side of it, which is building the city physically itself. But I'm more so focusing on the getting the people there in the first place. And obviously, the two go hand in hand. I assume people getting there to some degree brings the funding to actually build it. And in what order that happens, I'm not sure. But the willingness to move and sort of filtering for that is what I'm kind of curious to hear your perspective on.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I mean, first to start with the filtering, I mean, we have a very sort of like robust application process. People write like a written application, and then sort of now at the scale that we're at now, they all do a call with me and then an existing member, and then we sort of vote as to whether or not they sort of are a good fit. So we're scaling the community like very sort of slowly and deliberately. In terms of people moving, I mean, so we're building a global community. We sort of intentionally like we want to have hubs in existing cities, and we want to have sort of like collectives of people sort of in these cities that reflect our values and can share our values and can talk about what we're doing. So we're actually launching sort of these like praxis houses in Q1 of this year, or in 2021. In major cities for sort of like, before we launch the city, we're going to have these houses sort of in major cities that members can sort of live in and sort of migrate around between. And we want to keep the houses sort of have like the hub and spoke model and have these sort of spokes in major cities, where we have groups of people that can sort of share the values and so forth. So we don't expect 100% of the people in praxis to convert, because I mean, sometimes, yeah, I mean, like your parents get sick or something like that, and you have to sort of take care of them, or you get married, or for some reason you have a job in a place that sort of you can't leave, you can't go remote. So yeah, I mean, we definitely sort of appreciate that there's a lot of sort of like complexity in people's lives, and that it's hard to plan like two years in advance. Like it's kind of a long way off. But certainly we expect many, if not most, will move. And Yeah, I mean, we're given the opportunity to build like a new city, sort of with like blank sheet of paper. So I think we're going to make it like pretty cool, pretty compelling. I'll have a lot of details to share on like sort of specific physical characteristics fairly soon. But I think it's going to be pretty exciting for sort of most people that sort of can move, can make it work. Um, let's see. There's one other thing I was going to mention. Oh yeah, and then also like, I mean, just from the perspective of like a Praxis member, it's sort of like you don't have to make this sort of like, I think there are sort of two levels of commitment. I think some people will just pick up and move immediately, and other people will be a little bit more speculative, and they'll buy a villa and plan to spend at least summers there. And then they come for the summer, and then they sort of find out that their standard of living is like actually much higher, and there are a lot more sort of exciting things happening here than wherever sort of else they might live. And then they end up moving. So it doesn't have to be sort of this binary thing. It's like sort of I'm in one place or I'm in another. I think people are going to live more nomadic lives, and I expect a lot of Praxis members will come, initially for part of the year and end up deciding to stay.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. I want to go back a little bit to you mentioned like having these hubs to begin with in the States where people can go and either stay for some time or live more permanently with other members of the Praxis community. Is this, this makes sense to me as like an intermediate step. You have people maybe gathering in some, I don't know if it's a city or like a more rural area outside of some more popular US cities where people, live somewhat in proximity that they might be able and willing to move without like too much disruption in what they're accustomed to. And then once they're kind of used to living with other Praxis members, I think you talk about loneliness is like a huge issue. I know before COVID, even I was looking into like it wasn't hard to see that remote work was a trend that was only going to grow and potentially accelerate. I don't think too many people saw like COVID being or a pandemic of like sorts being like the specific thing that would accelerate it as much as it has overnight. And obviously, it might return to some degree to being people working more physically, but the cat's kind of out of the bag and people have certain expectations and a lot of people have come to like working remotely. And I think there's only so much that you can kind of rewind to where we were. And we've taken kind of, looking back, it'll look like we took like a stepwise um, advancement towards remote, and then it'll continue to probably grow from there. Once you have, and so, with that trend, I was like looking into remote work a little bit, and the number one, complaint, while people might have enjoyed it overall, the number one complaint to your point was that people were lonely. And it makes sense. And so if you give these people close to where they are now the opportunity to work with like-minded people who are ambitious and optimistic about the future and trying to find, their heroic project, it can become much more real and much more compelling, I think, for people to then be ready to take the next step and move to someplace in the Mediterranean, whether it's just for summers to start, like you said, or on more of a full-time basis. Is this something that like this is a serious, transitionary step between where you are now, which is more so online, to where you're going to be and like building a full-fledged city? Or is this kind of just a something to do while COVID, restricts the international aspects? And then, I'm sorry to give you these multi-part questions, but there's a lot of interesting aspects in play. My other question would be really, building a city obviously physically is not a trivial task, especially one that can offer, like you said, some more attractive ways of life than other competing cities around the world. How do you think about funding and then going and actually building a city like that?
Yeah, I mean, so, well, the initial question, I mean, yeah, I think so. There's this philosopher, Ibn Khaldun, who has some sort of interesting theories about the nature of history, and he describes this sort of civilizational sort of cycle, like sort of cyclical process whereby you have these nomadic tribes that sort of wander around the desert, and to survive in an environment where you don't have a consistent food source or consistent water source, you have to develop the sense of group feeling that he refers to as asabiya. Um, And this is sort of like the lifeblood of civilization. This asabiya, this group feeling, these are shared, maybe not shared values. That's probably an imprecise translation, but sort of something like this, a sort of moral core that helps people coordinate. In a highly effective way. And to the extent that these nomadic tribes sort of are, really good at sort of coordinating amongst themselves, they're able to sort of gather the resources and like sort of find, land and so forth, and sort of plant their feet and develop into sort of a full-fledged civilization. And certainly we live in totally different times. And sort of the struggle is not as real as it was for these sort of nomadic tribes. But I think there is sort of an interesting insight there. And yeah, I mean, for us, sort of our first step, sort of in the physical world, is developing this sort of nomadic community of like-minded people. And I think, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of companies that sort of have interesting sort of like co-living models and so forth. But I think the sort of core insight is like living sort of like moving between cities, moving between houses and enclaves with your friends. And sort of you go to LA, you go to sort of Utah or wherever it might be, and your friends are there waiting for you, and perhaps they're friends you haven't seen in a little while, and maybe you make new friends that are working on interesting projects and sort of share your optimistic vision for the future. But I think that's like highly compelling to me. And so yeah, that's the first step. It's building this sort of nomadic tribe of Praxis members that sort of will migrate between these different hubs before we sort of plant our feet as a sort of new society and build this and build this city. And in terms of actually building the physical project, I mean, yeah. So I guess, well, what can I tell you about that? It's kind of there are a bunch of things I could touch on.
So like two pieces, I guess the first would be funding. Like, what do you expect for an initial kind of deployment of a city? How much that will cost and where you're getting it? I know like Pronomos is one of your backers, which is kind of interesting because like you mentioned some of the inspiration from like Peter Thiel talks about kind of the Great Stagnation, and I know you got like you won the grant from Tyler Cowen as well, who wrote the book on that. So it seems like a lot of the people financially backing the project directly or indirectly so far are very much aligned with the vision that you imagine. But it would seem that it would cost quite a bit of money to even just create a starter kind of template of a city. So kind of what you envision for the initial costs and how you expect to raise that money, and then secondarily, like what is that MVP of a city of sorts, like the minimal viable city, MVC, I guess you could call it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we want to build essentially a small college town. I think that's sort of perhaps not minimum, but certainly in terms of sort of like lifestyle quality, I think sort of, that's sort of a good sort of like pod kernel sort of MVP for a city is like a small college town. You don't know everyone, sort of many of the people, but there's sort of a deep sense of like trust and familiarity, sort of among sort of like members of this little pod. In terms of the fundraising, I don't want to sort of talk about like specific numbers, but certainly it'll be quite a bit of money. And yeah, I mean, we're going to have sort of a few different sources of capital. So the company is sort of actually two companies. It's an operating company and a property company. And the operating company will sort of like do the sort of like, front end research and build sort of, technology to operate the city. And then we'll earn sort of like an operating revenue stream, for doing so. And the property company is like a real estate development company. So we'll raise money from sort of traditional sort of sources. So we'll raise, some debt and some equity and I mean, certainly sort of operating company, we're raising VC. Property company will be more sort of traditional institutional sources.
Makes sense. And your point earlier about New York City, being worth, more than Apple is definitely intriguing and shows the potential for what certain land can work and what the return can be for the the company that owns the land, if and once you guys as the operational company are kind of able to set the vision and build it into reality. Uh, Last question, and then I want to give you the last word, but I read on your website, like you have a number of interests that you list, from like modern transportation to modular construction, which I imagine will be, basically everything that you list. Innovative governance, I think, was another one. Everything that you list obviously ties pretty well into what you're building here. And so it's no wonder that like this is the project that you've kind of chosen to commit yourself to. But it was interesting, like towards the last of your list of, towards the end of your list of interests, you talk about a number of defaults, like default food, default healthy food, default exercise and nature, a few other defaults, even as simple as like kind of the community that you've brought up a few times, the default of like feeling some trust and comfort in a community like you would on a college campus or in a college town. Um, what is the, like, how much time are you spending thinking about the various defaults that are important to you for this community? I have an appreciation for the power of defaults and how a number of defaults in our society today may be wrong. Can you talk about some of the things that you look forward to being able to set up differently in kind of the city of your dreams?
Yeah. So, I mean, here's a simple one. I'm not going to wear shoes probably almost ever when I'm walking around in the city. And I'm not sure if there are going to be like legal issues with this, but I don't want anyone who works for the company to wear shoes when they're walking around outside in the city, unless it's, like really, really cold or something like this. Because you simply could not do this in San Francisco or New York. You'd like cut your feet. You'd be stepping in disgusting things. It would be totally gross and unsafe. And I think like the bar is just so insanely low as far as sort of cleanliness and safety goes in modern cities. And it's just a travesty. You can do this in resorts, right? You can do this in some sort of gated communities, and that's not. And I think sort of that's not the vibe or sort of the energy that we want to cultivate. We don't want to do sort of big, tract home gated community at all. But certainly there are lessons that we can learn pertaining to like safety and like like cleanliness. Like and I think like using these like little things, like not wearing shoes, like you just have to notice. Like you have to notice if things are not like clean and safe. And yeah, so I've been like thinking about how we can develop little sort of things like this to like enforce super high standards.
Yeah, it's a super interesting example. It sounds like a community that Steve Jobs might like to be a part of, and so that's a pretty good one to build, I think. I want to wrap it up here. I know we're coming up on time, but really appreciate you taking the time to share your vision today and talk about Blue Book Cities and Praxis. I'm excited to see how it all unfolds. It's obviously very early days, and no one really knows how anything is going to settle post pandemic. But I think people like you who are trying to create, communities or companies or whatever it might be, working on a better future, those are the types of people I like talking to. So appreciate you taking the time today. Where can people go to learn more about Blue Book Cities, apply to Praxis, read some of your writing, everything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I share the most information on Twitter. So like it's at Dryden WT Brown. I have a website that's drydenbrown.org. And to apply to Praxis, go to bluebookcities.com. And yeah, I don't know when this podcast is going to air, but we're going to break out Praxis into a separate website. But either way, there will be a link at Blue Book Cities that you can find.